In the winter of 1930, she was diagnosed with schizophrenic paranoia and later confined to a psychiatric institution with her family's approval. A heavy wooden door was firmly shut against a royal woman whose life was being sealed off from the world she knew. Yet years later, another door would open under the cover of darkness to offer sanctuary to desperate refugees fleeing for their lives. Her family and the institutions around her came to treat her as unfit for public life. The historical record, however, eventually recognized her as a woman of extraordinary moral clarity. To understand how a royal outcast became a silent hero, we must return to the very beginning. In June of 1953, Westminster Abbey was filled with the crimson velvet and gold regalia of the British monarchy. It was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, a vast state spectacle and one of the most widely watched royal ceremonies of its era. Yet, a deliberate blind spot existed near the front rows. As the sharp morning light filtered down through the high, stained glass windows, it fell directly upon a heavy metal crucifix resting against a mist-gray nun's habit. Prince Philip's mother sat there almost unnoticed at the formal center of British royal power. She did not offer a single wave to the gathering crowds. She produced no polite smile for the media lenses sweeping past her assigned aisle. At 68 years old, her face was tightly framed by a simple veil, leaving only her calm, unreadable eyes exposed. Those eyes looked straight ahead, remaining motionless amidst the loud celebration. She carried the stillness of someone who had spent decades learning how to disappear in plain sight. That stillness had become a form of armor. She understood what survival looked like inside a rigid hierarchy. Refusing to attract public attention was sometimes the only genuine power a woman could safely wield. Almost no one inside that abbey, or the millions watching through television screens, knew who she was. As the coronation music filled the cathedral, she offered a slight blink of her eyelashes, betraying no internal emotion. She was Princess Alice of Battenberg, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria and the mother of Prince Philip. The public had slowly forgotten her existence. She vanished because history rarely documents women who choose silence over status. To understand why she later chose a rough habit instead of a glittering tiara, we have to return to her earliest years. The silence surrounding her life did not begin as a choice. It began at birth. It began in February 1885, inside a silk-lined space known as the Tapestry Room at Windsor Castle. Queen Victoria stood over a quiet crib, looking down at her newborn great-granddaughter. The aging monarch picked up her pen and noted in her private diary that the infant was remarkably pretty. Alice was born into the peak of European aristocratic power. The room was filled with royal courtiers and the immense weight of the British establishment. Yet no one in that grand space recognized a harsh physical reality. The child was born deaf. The adults dictated the future of nations right beside her crib, unaware that the infant could hear nothing at all. It took 4 long years for the family to finally realize the unusual stillness surrounding the young girl. During that extended period, Alice would sit in heavily decorated rooms, her large eyes wide open, staring intently at the adults around her. She watched their moving mouths open and close, producing absolutely no sound. She was essentially living inside a continuous, silent film. The rest of her family operated in a demanding vocal reality. The royal household did not alter its rigid expectations to accommodate a severe physical limitation. Instead, she constructed her own understanding of the world by carefully assembling fragmented visual clues. That limitation did not turn her into a weak shadow. She watched the subtle movements of jaw muscles, her sharp eyes functioning as her ears, to process conversations with intense visual concentration. She taught herself the difficult art of lip reading, mastering it in English, French, German, and eventually Greek. Because she could not hear, courtiers often assumed she could not understand them. Being underestimated provided a perfect cover for a highly observant intellect. She learned to survive in a world not built for her, long before she stepped into a volatile new kingdom, and her path into that new world opened when she met Prince Andrew of Greece. In 1902, an 18-year-old Alice met Prince Andrew of Greece in London. He was confident, quickly securing her attention. Their wedding in 1903 became a massive assembly of European nobility. Yet, she refused the role of a docile royal muse. According to later accounts, Tsar Nicholas II playfully threw a spare shoe toward the newly married couple, and Alice threw it back. The gesture showed a woman with energy, nerve, and no instinct to shrink herself for royal company. Stepping into Athens, she faced a young kingdom defined by public skepticism. The Greek people often viewed their imported royal family with deep suspicion. As a foreign-born princess, she could have easily retreated behind guarded palace walls. Instead, she chose the demanding path of integration. In the crowded local markets, she relied on her intense visual focus, carefully reading the moving lips of ordinary Greek women. It was a slow, deliberate process of translation. She stubbornly learned the Greek language by directly observing the working citizens who spoke it every day. She did not just marry the court. She actively transformed herself into a part of the country. Her commitment was tested when the Balkan Wars erupted in 1912. Royal consorts usually remained distant symbols during conflicts. Alice discarded that precedent entirely. She traveled directly to the medical field stations. Her royal hands were soon covered in dirt as she carefully bandaged wounded soldiers. She managed depleted supplies and slept in rough spaces near the wards. She acted out of profound empathy, never seeking favorable press. She eventually earned the Royal Red Cross, proving she was entirely worthy of the kingdom. But history was preparing to strip that world away from her. The Greek political system was already unstable, and the monarchy was heading toward deeper danger. The stability in Greece proved to be a fleeting illusion. In 1917, volatile internal politics forced the royal family into immediate exile. Heavy palace doors were slammed shut in haste as they fled the capital under the cover of night. The royal household sought temporary refuge in Switzerland, waiting for the political tide to turn. While they eventually managed to return to Athens, a devastating military defeat in 1922 completely collapsed the state infrastructure. The sudden failure pushed the monarchy to the edge of ruin. The situation escalated into an urgent struggle to protect their physical lives. The cost of that political failure was not limited to the loss of a crown. Prince Andrew was positioned as the primary scapegoat for the disastrous campaign. Alice watched as her husband faced a rapid revolutionary tribunal, his life suddenly hanging in the balance. The threat of the harshest punishment became a terrifying reality for the family. The crisis required immediate, high-level diplomatic intervention. King George V of Great Britain authorized an emergency rescue mission to extract his Greek relatives. He dispatched a naval vessel to secure Andrew before the new government could carry out a fatal sentence. They abandoned Greece on a British warship, leaving behind their entire established life. The evacuation was swift and entirely devoid of protocol. On the cold deck of the vessel, an 18-month-old boy with blonde hair lay curled inside a wooden fruit box. That improvised cot, lined with spare clothing, carried the infant Prince Philip away from his homeland. The child, who would later stand on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, began his journey as a displaced refugee. His early years were defined by sudden flight and the complete loss of national security. The family survived the immediate threat. They traveled toward the quiet suburbs of Paris, hoping to rebuild a fractured life. But the peace they found in France was a deception. Without a palace, the exiled family relied entirely on the protection of extended relatives. They settled into a modest house in Saint-Cloud, a quiet suburb on the edge of Paris. Alice dressed in simple, practical clothing that concealed her former rank. She spent her days carefully folding worn garments in a small charity shop established for destitute Greek refugees. Despite depending on her European family network for her own survival, she continued to work steadily for others. For her young son, Prince Philip, the atmosphere within this borrowed Parisian home felt remarkably secure. He would later recall these years in France as a distinctly happy and stable period. But years of war, exile, and political instability had begun to erode her resilience. By the late 1920s, Alice sought deeper meaning within the traditions of the Greek Orthodox faith. Her physical appearance altered as she adopted a strict ascetic diet, leaving her frame noticeably thin. Those around her observed that her eyes would often remain fixed on an empty, shadowed corner of the room, detached from her immediate environment. Repeated losses and public humiliations had begun to push her beyond the limits of what she could carry. She was searching for a permanent spiritual foundation in a world that had repeatedly proven to be highly unstable. Her religious devotion eventually took a form that unsettled the pragmatic people around her. Alice began to whisper quietly of complex religious visions. She told those nearby that she was receiving direct communication from God. The sudden intensity of these statements caused immediate alarm within the wider royal network. Whatever the exact nature of her psychological crisis, the family response quickly became one of control and containment. The growing panic within the household reached a breaking point, leading the family hierarchy to execute a calculated decision that would permanently alter the childhood of Prince Philip. In the winter of 1930, a quiet family picnic was carefully arranged. She was denied the opportunity to defend herself against the medical experts selected by her own family. The entire process was finalized with the cold, sterile signatures of two highly regarded psychiatrists on a formal diagnostic document. While Alice was entirely excluded from discussions regarding her future, the doctors officially concluded she suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The medical verdict had been firmly established without her consent. For the family, the remaining question was logistical. They needed to figure out how to physically remove her from the household without alarming her 9-year-old son, Philip. It was a forced institutionalization carried out with cold efficiency. Philip's grandmother devised a strategic plan that appeared gentle but left a devastating, permanent mark. She told the boy they were going on a family picnic to enjoy the afternoon. 9-year-old Philip was genuinely enthusiastic, happily gripping his woven picnic basket as he stepped off the property. He had no way of knowing he was being intentionally used as a distraction. As he walked away with his grandmother, a vehicle carrying unknown men began to slowly pull into the driveway to collect his mother. He left his home anticipating an outing, remaining completely unaware of the forced separation taking place behind his back. When Philip finally returned from the excursion, the atmosphere of the house had transformed into a hollow, frightening silence. His bewildered eyes darted across the empty rooms, and his calls for his mother were met with absolutely no response. No adult sat the 9-year-old down to explain the complex situation. His mother had not passed away, yet she was effectively erased from his daily existence by the adults in charge. The profound lack of explanation only deepened the sudden absence. The isolated young boy lost his mother that afternoon. As for Alice, she was thrown directly into the most detached medical system of the era. Her destination was a German sanatorium, where her case would soon draw some of the most famous names in psychiatry. At a clinic in Berlin, her condition caught the attention of the most famous psychoanalyst in history, Sigmund Freud. He did not evaluate her in person, yet he confidently diagnosed her spiritual crisis. His conclusions were finalized in a typed letter containing his cold, clinical advice. Freud claimed her religious visions were merely a biological symptom of severe sexual frustration. To treat her mind, he proposed a therapy aimed directly at her body. He recommended using high-intensity X-rays on her ovaries in an attempt to suppress what he believed was the source of the problem. It was a brutal medical directive that treated a woman's psychological distress as a reproductive problem to be physically suppressed. However, Alice never surrendered to those medical diagnoses. Transferred to a specialized sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, she maintained a fierce resistance against the clinical narrative. When faced with the psychiatrists probing her mind, she responded with a sharp upward thrust of her chin and angry, defiant eyes. She fought back against their psychoanalytic sessions, explicitly insisting to the staff that she was entirely sane. She repeatedly demanded the basic freedom to take a holiday, requesting a complete end to her forced confinement. But in a system built on absolute authority, every rational plea fell into institutional silence. Her clear demands for liberty were systematically documented as further symptoms of her supposed mental illness. The grim truth did not come from the doctors, but from her own family. Alice understood, with lasting resentment, who held the final power over her freedom. She learned the hospital would only grant her release with explicit permission from her mother. Her right to liberty was stripped away by her closest relative. She never forgave this betrayal. During 2 years of confinement beside a Swiss lake, the outside world kept moving while a mother remained shut behind 4 walls. The deeper pain was not confinement alone, but watching her children's lives move on without her. From the high window of the Swiss facility, she could only imagine the milestones of her children. While she remained confined, her 3 eldest daughters, Margarita, Theodora, and Cecilia, were married off to German aristocrats. 3 royal weddings were lavishly orchestrated across continental Europe. Not once did anyone arrange for the mother of the brides to be present. Inside her quiet room, her trembling hand would slowly turn the pages of a faded newspaper, stopping at a blurry photograph of a distant royal wedding. She learned about her daughters taking their vows by reading the press coverage entirely erased from the official family portrait. This isolation provoked reactions that observers easily dismissed as cruel. When personal mail arrived at the clinic, it contained a photograph of Cecilia holding a newborn grandchild. Instead of finding comfort, the quiet of her room was broken by the harsh sound of tearing paper. Alice coldly ripped the photograph into pieces. To the medical staff, this act appeared as proof of emotional detachment. Yet, the record suggests a different reality. It was the desperate reaction of a mother experiencing agonizing grief. Tearing the photograph was a visceral attempt to protect herself from the unbearable pain of witnessing a domestic happiness she was permanently forbidden to join. While she fought the doctors, the man who vowed to protect her chose an easier path. Prince Andrew relocated to the south of France, settling aboard a luxury yacht near Monte Carlo with his mistress, French actress Andrée Lafayette. While Alice remained locked behind clinical walls, the deck of Andrew's yacht was filled with sparkling champagne glasses and loose laughter. He spent his days gambling and appears to have visited his confined wife only rarely. Family, motherhood, and marriage all broke apart in front of her. When the sanatorium doors finally opened, the woman stepping out was no longer the Alice of the past. In 1932, she was formally released. But freedom looked very different once everything familiar had already been taken away. In 1932, she was formally released. She did not return to a royal residence or seek comfort from her relatives. Instead, a solitary woman pulling a worn suitcase stepped onto various uncertain European trains. Alice chose a transient existence, moving quietly between obscure boarding houses across the continent. She maintained basic written correspondence with her mother, but deliberately avoided contact with the wider royal network. The extended family that orchestrated her confinement was firmly shut out. Institutional trauma had permanently fractured her trust in the aristocratic system. She wandered through Central Europe, untethered from the rigid expectations of court life. Freedom meant the right to remain unseen by those who had judged her. She systematically stripped away the final symbols of her royal status. The transformation was stark, practical, and entirely deliberate. Holding a sharp pair of scissors, she cut off her long aristocratic hair, replacing it with a hastily brushed short crop. The heavy silks of her previous life were discarded. She chose to wear only worn, coarse fabric that allowed her to blend into common crowds. She rebuilt herself as a woman who could move through the world without being noticed. She operated as a princess without a country, a wife without a present husband, and a mother without children by her side. By adopting this austere appearance, she firmly rejected the public expectations of her bloodline. Rather than hiding in permanent anonymity, she chose to return to the place that had once expelled her family. In 1938, Alice traveled back to Athens alone. She did not arrive to reclaim political power. She immediately sought out the Red Cross, dedicating her hours to organizing food distribution. Her quick hands could be seen scooping hot soup for thin, orphaned children in impoverished districts. She anchored her life to the immediate needs of displaced refugees. Serving others provided a structured purpose the royal court had failed to offer. Amidst the poverty of Athens, she seemed to have found a concrete reason to live. But another blow came first. In 1937, before Europe was fully overtaken by war, tragedy struck from the sky. As Alice reconstructed her existence, a fatal accident struck. In 1937, her 26-year-old daughter Cecilia boarded a flight to London. She was heavily pregnant, traveling with her husband and 2 young sons to attend a family wedding. Thick fog severely obscured visibility along the route. Over Ostend, Belgium, the aircraft violently struck a tall factory chimney before plummeting directly to the ground. The impact left no survivors. Some later accounts suggest that Cecilia may have gone into labor during the descent, but the exact detail remains uncertain. The tragedy destroyed a future Alice had already been forced to watch from a distance. Cecilia's funeral marked the first time in years the scattered royal family stood under the same sky. The tragedy forced a bitter reunion in Germany. 16-year-old Philip stood with vacant eyes among the heavy floral wreaths, processing the sudden destruction of his sister's household. Beside him stood the quiet figure of Alice. She was finally face to face with Prince Andrew and the extended aristocratic network that authorized her confinement. Yet the historical record notes no public confrontations regarding their past actions. The overwhelming grief of the present moment silenced any lingering resentments. They gathered around the dark caskets as strangers bound by blood, united only by a shared loss. She stood beside the husband who left her, looking at the coffin of the daughter she was once forbidden to see. Alice kept her arms hanging loosely at her sides. Her pale face remained tearless, bracing against a pain too profound for display. There are no known historical accounts of her collapsing. Observers might mistake this stillness for detachment. The record suggests otherwise. Her quietness was the strict endurance of a mother who had survived a decade of trauma. That loss hardened something inside her, just as Nazi Germany moved toward Greece. When the German army flooded into Athens, matters of life and death confronted the royal family. In April 1941, the German army overwhelmed Athens. As the military occupation began, the Greek aristocracy and those with means hurriedly arranged their escapes. Heavy luxury cars carrying royal family members sped toward the harbor, desperate to reach exile in South Africa, Egypt, or London. Yet, one figure moved directly against the tide of fleeing elites. Alice walked deliberately back toward the center of the occupied capital. She was nearly 60 years old, profoundly deaf, and living entirely alone. Rather than seeking the safety of her international connections, she made a quiet calculation to remain. She chose to stand alongside the ordinary citizens who were already beginning to starve. Her personal position during the conflict was intensely precarious. She was trapped in a war that deeply fractured her own bloodline. Sitting in the dim candlelight of her apartment, she would look at 2 different sets of letters. One stack came from her son, Philip, who was actively serving in the British Royal Navy. The other came from her daughter's husbands, who were fighting directly for the Axis powers. The political reality was devastating, but Alice simply refused to engage in ideological commentary. She compartmentalized the familial division and poured all her energy into organizing local soup kitchens. She moved through the dangerous, militarized streets, completely ignoring the severe risks. The occupation reached another level of brutality when Jewish citizens came under direct pursuit. In the dead of night, a widow named Rachel Cohen came to Alice's door with her daughter, Tilda. Alice opened her home to them at once. Michelle joined them later. Harboring a Jewish family could bring the harshest punishment. Gestapo agents did not overlook her residence. When heavy, hobnailed boots rang out at her front door, she knew the moment had come. The Gestapo did not overlook any potential resistance, not even the residence of a royal princess. Heavy, iron-nailed boots echoed sharply against the cobblestone before a harsh knock struck the ground floor door. Upstairs, the terrified Cohen family lay completely still, peering through the narrow gaps in the floorboards with frightened eyes. Below them, German secret police entered the hallway to interrogate Alice directly. The stakes in that room were total. A single hesitation, nervous glance, or inconsistent answer could have destroyed everyone in the house. Harboring Jewish citizens carried an extreme risk. To survive, Alice had to execute the most critical performance of her life. Standing directly in front of the armed officers, she used something they failed to anticipate: silence. When the lead Gestapo officer aggressively shouted his questions, Alice offered only a perfectly calm, fabricated blank stare. For 60 years, she had mastered the complex art of lip reading in multiple languages. She understood exactly what the officer was demanding. Yet, she deliberately weaponized her own deafness. The disability that had once marginalized her in the royal courts now served as an impenetrable shield. She played the role of an elderly, disconnected woman who simply could not comprehend the loud demands of the world. The interrogation became a tactical stalemate. Unable to extract information from an unresponsive suspect, the Gestapo abandoned the effort. The lead German officer let out an exasperated sigh, turned, and marched out of the residence, leaving Alice standing quietly in the dim shadows. Her composure defeated the interrogation. Because of it, the Cohens remained secure through the darkest months of the war. What others had long treated as a weakness had now helped save 3 lives. But as the global conflict finally ended, her personal wealth was completely exhausted. Her final remaining jewels were traded for food and medicine. Only one priceless item remained. When peace was finally restored, a royal house that had once commanded vast wealth found itself financially exhausted. Alice possessed a royal jewelry box that now sat completely empty, resting alongside crumpled receipts for wheat and medical supplies purchased for local refugees. Throughout the grueling years of conflict and occupation, she had systematically liquidated her most valuable possessions. She did not sell them to maintain her own comfort or secure safe passage out of the country. The steady sale of her jewelry directly financed the soup kitchens in Athens, trading historic gems for immediate access to basic bread and antibiotics. However, within the remnants of her material wealth, she deliberately retained a single, highly significant item. Her wrinkled, aging hands carefully removed the sparkling diamonds from their setting within an old, tarnished meander tiara. This piece of jewelry had originally belonged to her own mother, given as a grand wedding gift by Tsar Nicholas II. By 1947, her son Philip was preparing to propose to Princess Elizabeth of Great Britain. At the time, he was a relatively junior naval officer with virtually no personal fortune to commission a suitable ring. He required an intervention from his mother to secure his future. Alice had no kingdom to offer her son and no intact family home to welcome her future daughter-in-law. She placed the loose, historic diamonds directly into Philip's hands, her tearful eyes reflecting a quiet, delayed attempt at maternal compensation. She offered the last remnants of her royal inheritance so he could have an engagement ring crafted. The diamonds that would soon sit on the hand of the future British monarch were more than a symbol of alliance. They were one of the last major gifts a mother could still make to her son. That gift helped formalize Philip's place inside the British establishment. Yet, during the celebration, his family was still missing crucial members. In November 1947, Westminster Abbey was heavily decorated to host the royal wedding of the decade. Yet the carefully curated guest list contained a glaring absence. A formal document outlining the royal attendees showed thick, decisive lines crossing out the names of the groom's 3 surviving biological sisters. The shadow of the Second World War remained thick over London, creating severe anti-German sentiment across the nation. Because her daughters had married German aristocrats with past connections to the Third Reich, the British establishment strictly forbade them from attending. The political optics of the post-war era proved stronger than familial bonds. The historical timing presented a cruel symmetry for Alice. During the early 1930s, she had been locked in a psychiatric facility, entirely missing the weddings of those very same daughters. Now, she was finally permitted to attend the marriage of her only son. But her daughters were the ones barred from entry. She sat in the Abbey, occasionally turning her calm eyes toward the empty seats beside her, where her family should have been. No photograph from the era captured her entire family standing together. A complete royal portrait simply did not exist for them. As Philip stood near the altar, he lacked the presence of a father or his sisters. He relied entirely on the mother whom society had once dismissed as permanently unstable. Alice sat upright and solitary in the northern section of the vast cathedral, directly facing the gathered authority of the British monarchy. She wore no spectacular jewels, serving as the sole representative of the fractured Greek royal house. She had sacrificed her remaining wealth to secure her son's position within this new establishment. She also understood that her family would remain peripheral to the British crown. As the heavy wedding bells finally stopped ringing, she realized her traditional royal duties were concluded. She was ready to take on a very different life. In 1949, Princess Alice officially rejected the privileges of a future queen mother. She was not fleeing the world, but finding a new way to engage with it. Her desk soon held detailed draft sketches for a new orphanage and a medical facility on the island of Tinos. She founded the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. This was not designed to be a closed, silent monastery. It was a nursing order built to step directly into the community, caring for the sick and the abandoned. She was consciously following the path of her late Aunt Ella in Russia, trading royal isolation for a life of active service. She never took formal vows to become an official nun, yet she wore a plain gray habit every single day. Her hands decisively pinned a heavy silver crucifix onto her unadorned chest, a deliberate replacement for every string of royal pearls she once possessed. The crown had previously bound her, dictated her movements, and ultimately helped commit her to an asylum. The new veil gave her a kind of protection she had never found inside court life. It cut through the expectations of high society and changed how people looked at her. By erasing the visual markers of aristocratic rank, she finally secured true personal freedom. The coarse fabric freed her from the old royal performance. This transformation left the aristocracy thoroughly baffled. A cloud of cigarette smoke would rise from the woman in a religious habit, quietly playing canasta. Alice refused to adopt an artificial holiness. Her own mother witnessed this and sighed, asking what anyone could say about a nun who smoked and played cards. But to the impoverished citizens of Athens, she was a genuine saint. Eventually, the sisterhood failed due to lack of funds, and her health declined. When political upheaval struck Greece again, a special flight was ordered out of London. In 1967, after decades apart, the British royal family decided to open their doors to welcome the wandering mother home. In April of 1967, Greece was shaken once again by a military coup. A British royal aircraft made an urgent landing in Athens. It arrived to collect a frail 82-year-old woman carrying nothing but a few old clothes. Princess Alice was physically failing. Her heart and lungs were weakening, and she was now profoundly deaf. She was stubborn and initially refused to abandon her life there. But Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip were absolute in their decision. They insisted she relocate to Buckingham Palace immediately. This time, her departure from the Mediterranean was not another desperate royal flight. It was a quiet journey toward a final refuge. Buckingham Palace, long accustomed to rigid protocols, suddenly had to adapt to an unusual guest. Palace servants would regularly grimace when they caught the unmistakable scent of cheap cigarette smoke drifting along the pristine, red-carpeted corridors. Alice continued to wear her plain gray habit as she wandered through the gilded rooms. She retained a razor-sharp intellect and could be quite demanding to those around her. She smoked constantly, played cards, and offered blunt observations. Yet, historical records note that Queen Elizabeth treated her mother-in-law with absolute patience and unfailing kindness. The monarch offered the eccentric older woman a safe sanctuary without demanding any strict royal conformity from her in return. Bringing his mother to the palace could not rewrite the past, but it soothed the present. Philip would stand quietly outside the door, watching his elderly mother playing cards by the window. Since that family picnic in 1930, he had grown up without her maternal presence. Having her live steps away was the greatest act of love a stoic royal could offer. They needed no large declarations. The fact that she was near was enough. But time always remains a cruel enemy. Realizing her life was ending, Alice wrote a private letter to the little boy of her past. It was not an apology, but a final command from a resilient heart. Before she died, she left behind a small piece of paper. The handwriting was messy, but deliberate, pressed onto the thin sheet. According to later accounts, the note began with the words, "Dearest Philip, be brave." She wrote that she would never leave him and that he would always find her when he needed her most. She signed it with all her devoted love as his old mama. This was the exact guarantee of permanence the 9-year-old boy had never received. She did not offer empty apologies for the lost decades. She gave him the one assurance he had never received as a child. The mother who had been taken away was now promising to remain with him in the only way she still could. She did not ask for forgiveness for her absence. She handed him the strength to continue. Philip stood holding the small paper, his hand gripping it tightly to hide any tremor behind a rigid royal mask. Being brave was exactly how Alice had survived. That specific courage carried her through the locked doors of the sanitarium, the falling bombs of the Second World War, and decades of isolation. Now she was passing that same instinct on to her son. He was the man bearing the massive weight of the British crown beside the Queen. The instruction was simple. He needed that raw endurance for the monarchy he now faithfully served. On a cold December day in 1969, the final silence enveloped her room. The scene inside Buckingham Palace was entirely still, with her coarse gray habit left neatly folded beside the bed. Princess Alice died in her sleep at 84 years old. There was no massive state funeral to mark her passing. Her departure was quiet. She left behind a glittering monarchy and a life marked by unusual endurance. Yet, Windsor Castle was not where she wanted to remain, but the place she wanted to rest was somewhere far away, sacred, and politically charged. Almost 20 years after her death, a secret journey took her remains across the sea. For 19 years, the remains of Princess Alice rested temporarily inside the royal vault at Windsor. Her casket sat upon a cold stone slab beneath St. George's Chapel. That crypt belonged to the British monarchy, but it did not belong to her final faith. Although she was placed securely alongside the historic kings and queens of England, Windsor was never her intended destination. She had no desire to be absorbed into the conventional royal narrative after her passing. She had already clearly instructed her family exactly where she wanted to be laid to rest. She chose a resting place far from the stone walls of the British palaces. She did not want to lie beside wealthy monarchs. She wanted to rest beside a saint. Her chosen location was the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. She demanded to be buried near her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, who inspired her religious order before being killed in Russia. When she first announced this plan, her royal relatives immediately complained about the extreme distance. They argued it would be too difficult to regularly visit her grave. Alice reportedly met those objections with dry sarcasm. She dismissed their conveniences entirely and sharply replied, "Nonsense. There is a perfectly good bus service going directly there." In 1988, that request was finally honored. Her small coffin was carried into the Russian Orthodox Church, nestled beneath its brilliant golden onion domes in Jerusalem. Prince Philip and Prince Charles traveled there to personally escort her remains into the sanctuary. In Jerusalem, the woman who had spent her life between unstable states was finally laid to rest on her own terms. She was finally at rest. Even then, her wartime courage still had not received its fullest public recognition. That specific historical debt would only be paid in full in 1993, when the truth hidden inside a dark Athens attic was fully exposed. Her silent sacrifice was not forgotten forever. In 1993, Israel officially honored her as righteous among the nations for protecting the Cohen family. The following year, Prince Philip attended the ceremony at Yad Vashem and spoke publicly about her courage. He said she would never have considered her actions to be anything unusual, and that she simply saw them as a natural human response to people in distress. The story returns to that famous photograph from the 1953 coronation. Public attention settled on the crowns at the center of the room, but the deeper weight of the image sits closer to the edge. There, in a simple gray habit, stands a woman the palace could not easily place inside its polished myth. She had survived confinement, exile, war, and erasure. In the end, history proved harder to control than royal image. Princess Alice remains one of the most unusual figures ever to stand inside that frame.